In the suburban silence of Oak Creek, when the neighborhood still slumbered beneath a sky that had not yet turned to dawn, a German shepherd dragged a child from his nursery, not with barking, not with warning, but with a certainty so absolute and terrifying it could have only come from something deeper than training. Seconds later, the house erupted behind them, and in the driveway only his stance remained, four paws planted in dew-slicked grass, eyes reflecting flames he had predicted before smoke ever reached the ceiling. But the strangest question remained: how did he know? The clock over Oak Creek had not yet released the neighborhood from sleep, and the darkness clung to the eaves of the Carter home like a heavy quilt, draped across brick and vinyl siding that bore the pride of a firefighter's care. Every gutter clean, every detector tested, the kind of maintenance that came not from paranoia, but from profession. The house sat quietly among identical colonials, every window dark, every lawn still, as if the entire street was holding its breath, waiting for the first alarm clock to shatter the grip of night. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator dared to move, each vibration sounding like a heartbeat into forbidden silence. Rex lay outside Noah's nursery door as he always did, not asleep, not pacing, simply vigilant. His breath was steady, but his ears remained forward, not from anxiety, but because something in the walls had shifted. Not a creak, not a smell exactly, but a frequency too high to be named, something like a thin wire screaming beneath the plaster, the kind only a creature who had been born to listen would ever notice. Inside the nursery, Noah stirred in his crib near the window, his small hand brushing the edge of his stuffed elephant as the nightlight cast a gentle glow across his cheek, soft and pink like a peach warming in morning sun. In that moment, so still it could have passed for safety, Rex rose. His paws landed like thunder on the hardwood floor, and he approached the crib, not circling, not hesitating, just a single motion of pure intention. And then, as if answering a frequency only he could hear, he gripped the waistband of Noah's pajamas gently in his teeth and began to pull. The fabric stretched across the mattress with a whisper so soft it blended into the hum of the baby monitor, like static mistaken for silence. Noah didn't cry, his small body cradled against Rex's shoulder as the dog slowly backed from the room. He paused whenever the child shifted, adjusting his grip with the precision of someone who had calculated every angle, every second, in a language he could never share. Down the hall in the master bedroom, Emily woke. The faint scratch of claws was enough to pull her eyes open, and when she turned toward Daniel, her breath caught. Not because of a sound, but because of the shadow moving past their doorway, large, deliberate, wrong for this hour, wrong for any hour. "Daniel," she whispered, controlled but urgent, "something's happening." Within seconds, both were on their feet, bare soles slapping down the hallway, their heartbeats falling into step with their instincts. Noah's door stood wide open, and in the hallway just beyond, they caught the retreating form of a sable and black blur and the trailing edge of white pajamas moving steadily toward the stairs. "Rex!" Emily's voice cracked like a whip in the air, sharp and maternal. Daniel bolted ahead. At the top of the stairs, Rex stood frozen. His eyes were steady, not frantic, not wild, just filled with one command: move. Noah squirmed faintly in the dog's grip, his hands reaching upward as if grasping for clouds. Daniel lunged forward with a firefighter's reflex, scooping his son into his arms with a single motion, holding him tightly as though pulling him back from some unseen ledge between caution and catastrophe. That's when Emily dropped to her knees beside Rex, one hand already reaching to grab his collar, the question forming on her lips: why? But the answer came before she could speak. The smell. Not strong, not sharp, but unmistakable. Ozone. Daniel turned instinctively, his eyes tracing the hallway until they landed on the darkness pooling at the edge of Noah's doorway. He took one step, then another, before his gaze locked on something invisible, a shimmer in the air above the baseboard, heat rising against the grain of the wallpaper like breath fogging glass. Emily reached him just as Rex bolted past them both, heading down the stairs with a speed that spoke of certainty, not fear. Behind them, the first faint crackle echoed like paper crumpling against metal, and then Noah whimpered, soft, disoriented, caught between sleep and something trying to take shape. Rex stood at the front door, his head lifted high, shadow stretched long across the foyer tile, facing away from the nursery now glowing with an orange pulse behind its closed door. He wasn't looking at the danger, he was looking at Daniel, holding the gaze like a finished sentence. Daniel tightened his grip around Noah's back, hand trembling but sure as he reached for the deadbolt and yanked the door open with controlled force. Cold morning air flooded in, wet with dew, rich with the scent of cut grass, and now unexpectedly electric, not just smoke, but a warning woven into wind. Emily pressed Noah to her chest, her nightshirt whipped in the gust, hair tangled like wheat in a storm, and her feet found the cold concrete of the porch by instinct alone, as her entire body moved with one directive: get the baby away. Rex dashed forward, not panicked, not frantic, but with the urgency of someone who had already calculated what delay would cost. Dew clung to his thick coat, shimmering under the streetlight, and each step carved a path through the grass leading toward the driveway. Behind them, as Daniel pulled the door shut, the house hissed louder, like pressure building in lungs no longer holding back. He turned once more, arms wrapped around the only two people who mattered, eyes scanning the nursery window now backlit with light that no longer flickered, but roared, wild and knowing behind glass that had just begun to warp. Noah cried harder now, tiny fists gripping his father's shirt like anchors in chaos. Daniel whispered something close to his ear, then nodded toward Emily, and together they moved toward the driveway where Rex had waited. The German shepherd turned once, meeting them with the same gaze he'd held since the beginning, not anxious, not wild, just certain, as if all of this had already happened in frequencies they couldn't hear, and he had simply been waiting for the others to catch up. And then the windows exploded. The first thing Rex heard was not a sound that could be named. It was a frequency, a pitch so high and thin it lived in the space between silence and pain, the kind of vibration that made his teeth ache and his skull feel too small for his brain. He had heard it before, twice in his life, both times in the sterile corridors of the canine training facility, where fluorescent lights hummed like angry wasps, and the old wiring groaned beneath the weight of a building that had been standing since before anyone thought to update the electrical code. This was the same hiss, the same invisible scream, but worse, closer, urgent. Rex lifted his head from his paws, ears rotating like radar dishes toward the nursery wall. The clock on the hallway table read 4 a.m., the glowing numbers casting a faint green hue across the hardwood floor where he had stationed himself every night since Noah came home from the hospital. The house was still, the kind of stillness that people mistake for peace, but Rex knew better. Stillness was just noise holding its breath. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement after hours of motionless vigilance, but his focus never wavered from the wall. Behind the pastel blue paint and the framed photos of Noah's first smile, something was happening, something wrong. The hiss climbed higher, sharper, until it felt like needles being driven into the soft tissue behind his eyes. He took a step toward the nursery door, then stopped. Protocol said to alert the handlers. Protocol said to bark, to signal, to make them understand. But Protocol had also said he was too sensitive, too reactive, unsuitable for field work. Protocol had sent him to a rescue shelter with a file marked behavioral concerns, when all he had ever done was try to warn them. He looked back toward the master bedroom where Daniel and Emily slept, their door cracked open just enough for them to hear Noah if he cried. But Noah wasn't crying. Noah was sleeping in a room where the walls were screaming, and Rex knew with the terrible certainty of someone who had been ignored before that by the time the humans heard it, by the time they smelled it, by the time their inferior senses finally caught up to the reality he was living in, it would already be too late. He made the choice in less than a second. The nursery door stood ajar, always left that way for airflow, and Rex pushed through it with his shoulder, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who knew that speed without precision was just panic. The nightlight cast long shadows across the crib, and Noah lay on his back, one arm flung above his head, the other clutching his elephant, breathing in the soft, oblivious rhythm of infant sleep. Rex approached the crib, his nose already cataloging the air, searching for the acrid tang of smoke, the chemical burn of melting plastic, but there was nothing, not yet. The danger was still invisible, still trapped behind drywall and insulation, but it was coming. The hiss told him so. The hiss that now felt like it was originating from directly behind the wall where Noah's crib sat, where the electrical junction box fed power to the overhead light and the humidifier, and the baby monitor that Daniel had installed himself with the confidence of a man who had spent 20 years in burning buildings and thought he knew what danger looked like. Rex didn't have time to explain. He didn't have the words. He only had action. He gripped the waistband of Noah's pajamas in his teeth, the fabric bunching between his molars as he applied just enough pressure to lift without piercing, just enough force to move without hurting. Noah's weight shifted, his small body rising from the mattress like a parachute catching air, and Rex began to back out of the room, his neck muscles straining, his jaw locked in a grip that had been bred into him for generations, the same grip his ancestors had used to pull children from frozen rivers and soldiers from battlefield smoke. Noah stirred, a small sound of confusion escaping his lips, but he didn't cry. Something in the steady rhythm of Rex's movement, the warmth of his breath, the certainty of his purpose, kept the child calm, suspended in that space between sleep and waking, where the world is still soft and nothing has decided to be frightening yet. Rex cleared the threshold of the nursery just as the hiss spiked into something sharper, something that felt like a warning turning into a promise. His paws hit the hallway floor, and he kept moving, kept backing toward the stairs, his eyes never leaving Noah's face, watching for any sign of distress, any indication that his grip had slipped or his angle had shifted wrong. Behind him, down the hall, he heard the first stirrings of movement from the master bedroom, a voice, Emily's, thick with sleep and confusion, then faster movement, footsteps, the sudden acceleration of people realizing that the shape of their night has changed. But Rex didn't stop. He had made a choice. He had bypassed protocol, bypassed permission, bypassed everything except the one truth his nervous system had been screaming since the moment that frequency first pierced the walls. The child had to move, and he had to move now. The stairs loomed ahead, and Rex calculated the descent with the precision of someone who understood that this was the moment where everything could go wrong, where one misstep could turn rescue into tragedy. Daniel's hands closed around Rex's collar, just as the dog's paws hit the dew-soaked grass. And for one terrible moment, father and dog were locked in a struggle that neither of them wanted, but both of them believed was necessary. Daniel's firefighter instincts screamed that dogs don't drag babies from their beds, that this was wrong, that Rex had finally snapped in some way that all the shelter warnings had hinted at but never fully explained. His grip tightened, his other arm already reaching to reclaim his son from the animal's jaws, when Emily's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. "Daniel, wait!" But he wasn't waiting. He yanked hard on Rex's collar, pulling the dog sideways, and Noah tumbled free onto the grass with a soft grunt of surprise. Daniel scooped him up in one motion, turning his body to shield his son from the animal he had trusted, the animal he was now convinced had just tried to harm his child. And that's when he saw Emily standing on the porch, one hand pressed against her mouth, the other pointing back at the house. Not at them, behind them. Daniel turned, Noah clutched against his chest, and his 20 years of training, his 2 decades of reading smoke and flame and structural failure, all of it crystallized into a single, horrible moment of recognition. The nursery window was glowing, not with light, with heat. The glass had taken on that particular shimmer that meant the temperature differential had reached critical mass, that the oxygen inside was being consumed faster than it could be replaced, that pressure was building behind a seal that was about to fail catastrophically. "Get back!" His voice came out raw, stripped of everything except command, and he was already moving, already crossing the lawn in long strides that ate up distance, while his mind calculated angles and blast radius, and whether they were far enough, whether they had seconds or just fractions of seconds, whether Rex had given them enough time, or if the universe was about to teach him the cruelest lesson a firefighter could learn, that you can know everything about fire and still lose everything to it. Emily ran to meet him, her bare feet slipping on grass that was slick with more than dew now, slick with the condensation that forms when superheated air meets cold morning atmosphere, and Daniel grabbed her with his free arm, pulling her into the shelter of his body, making himself into a wall between his family and the home they had built together. Rex suckled them once, his movements sharp and agitated, no longer the calm certainty of the rescue, but something frantic, something that looked like fear or maybe vindication, and he barked, one single sound that carried all the urgency his earlier silence had contained, and then he planted himself between the family and the house, his body low, his stance wide, like he was preparing to physically hold back what was coming. The first window exploded outward with a sound like a cannon shot, and Daniel felt the compression wave hit his chest, felt the air itself become a fist that wanted to knock him backward. Glass transformed into a glittering cloud of shrapnel, each piece catching the streetlight as it arced through the air, and he bent himself double over Noah and Emily, making his back into a roof, waiting for the impact of glass against skin, waiting for pain that would tell him whether his body had been shielded enough. But the glass fell short, landing in the landscaping and across the driveway, tinkling and singing as it settled. And for one heartbeat, Daniel thought maybe that was it. Maybe that was the worst of it. Maybe they could still salvage something, call it in, get the trucks here before the structure was lost. Then the second window blew, and the third. And the fire that had been building behind those walls, feeding on insulation and drywall and the old wiring that the home inspector had flagged as functional but aging, finally found its oxygen supply and announced itself to the world with a roar that Daniel felt in his bones. Flames punched through the window frames like fists, reaching up toward the eaves, finding the soffit vents, discovering the pathway into the attic where the real fuel waited, where the old Christmas decorations and stored baby clothes and all the accumulated memories of their lives together sat patient and dry and ready to burn. The house went up like it had been waiting for permission, like it had been holding back out of politeness, and now finally had license to show its true nature. Daniel watched his home transform from shelter to inferno in the span of a breath, watched the fire climb the exterior wall and punch through the roof, watched the bedroom window where he and Emily had slept 20 minutes ago fill with an orange glow that spoke of complete interior involvement, and he understood with the sick certainty of someone who had seen this happen to other families, other homes, that there was no saving this. Noah began to cry finally, the sound small and confused against the crackling roar of their lives being consumed. Emily was saying something, her voice lost beneath the fire's voice, and Daniel pulled them both tighter, turned them away from the sight, oriented their bodies toward the street where neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes, where distant sirens were already beginning to wail. Rex sat at Daniel's feet, close enough that his shoulder pressed against Daniel's leg, and when Daniel looked down, the dog looked up, and there was no triumph in those eyes, no satisfaction, just a terrible weariness that said he had done what he needed to do, and now the rest was up to the humans to survive. The first engine arrived 6 minutes after Daniel's call, which meant it had been 8 minutes since the windows blew, which meant it had been maybe 12 minutes since Rex had made his decision in the hallway, and Daniel knew that in firefighting terms, 12 minutes was the difference between containment and total loss. He stood in Mark Reynolds' driveway 3 houses down, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent, watching his crew deploy with the efficiency of people who had trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times. Except this time, the homeowner wasn't some stranger in shock, some civilian who needed to be guided away from the scene and given platitudes about insurance and belongings being replaceable. This time, the homeowner was him. Captain Rodriguez was first out of the cab, his eyes scanning the structure with the practiced assessment of someone reading a language most people never learned. And when his gaze found Daniel standing in the neighbor's driveway, something crossed his face that was worse than surprise, worse than concern. It was recognition, the kind of recognition that came with questions Daniel didn't want to answer. Rodriguez crossed the distance between them in long strides, his turnout gear already half-fastened, his radio crackling with dispatch updates and mutual aid confirmations. "Carter," he said, and it wasn't a greeting, it was an accusation wrapped in confusion. What the hell happened? Daniel opened his mouth and found that all his words had been replaced by ash. How did he explain that he had been asleep, that his smoke detectors hadn't activated, that there had been no audible alarm, no smell, no indication that the walls of his son's nursery were minutes away from catastrophic failure? How did he tell his captain that the only reason his family was alive was because a dog that had washed out of canine training, a dog that the shelter had warned might have behavioral sensitivities, had known something that Daniel's professional-grade equipment, his years of experience, his firefighter's instincts had all completely missed? Electrical fire, Daniel managed, his voice coming out flat and technical, retreating into the safety of terminology. Started in the nursery wall, junction box, I think. No smoke detector activation before breach. Rodriguez's expression shifted from confusion to something sharper. Your detectors didn't go off? No. At all? Not until after the windows blew. Daniel could hear how it sounded, could hear the implicit failure in every word. Firefighters were supposed to be the ones who knew better, who installed extra detectors, who tested their systems religiously, who made their homes into fortresses against the very thing they fought for a living. They weren't supposed to be the cautionary tales. Rodriguez looked back at the house, at the flames that were now punching through the second-story windows, at the roof that was beginning to sag in the middle where the support beams were failing. How'd you get out? This was the question Daniel had been dreading, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was simple, embarrassingly simple, humiliatingly simple. "The dog," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew how they would sound. "Rex. He pulled Noah out of his crib, dragged him down the stairs. We followed them out." Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel could see the captain's mind working, trying to reconcile this information with everything he knew about residential fires, about detection systems, about the protocols they all lived by. "Your dog," Rodriguez repeated slowly. "Your dog detected an electrical fire that your smoke detectors missed." "Yes." "And extracted your son before you even knew there was a problem." "Yes." The silence between them stretched out, filled with the sound of water hitting fire, of glass breaking, of men shouting coordinates and ventilation points. Finally, Rodriguez exhaled through his nose, the sound carrying years of experience, and the weight of having to write a report that would make no sense to anyone who wasn't standing here right now. "Carter," he said, his voice dropping lower, "you know how this looks." Daniel did know. It looked like negligence. It looked like a firefighter who had gotten complacent, who had trusted his training over his vigilance, who had somehow missed the signs that should have been obvious to someone with his background. It looked like the kind of story that got circulated in firehouses as a warning, the kind of incident that made it into training manuals under the heading of professional arrogance. "My detectors were current," Daniel said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice and hating it. "I tested them last month. The wiring was inspected when we moved in 3 years ago. There was no smell, no visible smoke, nothing that would have triggered standard protocols. Until your dog decided otherwise." "Until my dog decided otherwise," Daniel agreed, and the admission felt like swallowing broken glass. Emily appeared at his elbow, still clutched against her chest. The baby's crying finally subsided into the shocked silence of a child who had been overwhelmed past the point of protest. "Daniel," she said softly, and when he looked at her, he saw not accusation, but something worse, gratitude mixed with terror, the horrible realization that they were seconds away from a completely different outcome. Rodriguez followed Daniel's gaze to Emily and Noah, and something in his expression softened fractionally. "I need a full statement, and we're going to have to bring in an investigator, standard procedure for a firefighter's residence." "I know." "And Carter?" Rodriguez paused, his hand already reaching for his radio. "Test your dog. Whatever he sensed, whatever he heard or smelled or felt, document it, because right now that animal's testimony is the only thing standing between you and a review board asking why you were asleep while your house burned around you." Daniel nodded, unable to speak, and watched his captain walk back toward the engine, toward the organized chaos of men fighting a fire that Daniel should have prevented, should have detected, should have handled himself. He looked down at Rex, who sat calmly beside Mark Reynolds' mailbox, his eyes fixed on the burning house with the same steady gaze he'd maintained since the moment he'd decided that protocol wasn't enough. The sun had been up for 3 hours by the time the fire was fully extinguished, and Daniel sat on Mark Reynolds' back porch, watching the smoke curl up from the blackened skeleton that used to be his home. Emily had taken Noah inside to sleep in the Reynolds' guest room, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and shock, and Daniel was left alone with his thoughts and a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands an hour ago. He couldn't stop running the timeline backward, trying to find the moment where his professional instincts should have kicked in, the point where he should have known, should have sensed something wrong. The screen door creaked behind him, and Mark stepped out carrying 2 fresh mugs of coffee, one of which he pressed into Daniel's hands with the gentle insistence of someone who understood that routine could be an anchor when everything else had come unmoored. Mark was a county sheriff's deputy, the kind of neighbor who noticed things, who kept irregular hours, whose driveway collected patrol cars at odd times of the morning when shifts changed and paperwork needed to be filed from home. "You should try the sleep," Mark said, settling into the chair beside Daniel with a grunt that spoke of too many years in a uniform that required sitting in cars for long stretches. "Can't," Daniel replied, and it was true. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the windows exploding, saw the flames reaching for the roof, saw Noah's small face in the moment Rex had dropped him onto the grass. "Keep thinking about what I missed." Mark was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was choosing his words carefully, weighing whether what he was about to say would help or hurt. "You didn't miss anything," he finally said. Daniel looked at him sharply. "My house burned down while I was asleep. That's the definition of missing something." "No," Mark said, shaking his head slowly. "I mean, you couldn't have missed it. There was nothing to miss. Not for you, anyway." Something in his tone made Daniel set down his coffee, made him turn his full attention to his neighbor. "What do you mean?" Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the remains of Daniel's home, and when he spoke, his voice had the measured quality of someone giving witness testimony. "I got home from my shift around 1:30 this morning. Late night, domestic call that turned into a standoff. I was wired, you know how it is, couldn't go straight to bed, so I sat out here for a while, just decompressing." Daniel nodded, understanding the impulse. He'd done the same thing after bad calls, after fires where they'd pulled someone out too late or not at all, when the adrenaline needed somewhere to go before sleep was even a possibility. "I saw Rex," Mark continued, his fingers tapping against his mug in a rhythm that suggested he'd been thinking about this for hours. "I saw him in your front yard, pacing the perimeter. Not playing, not wandering, pacing, like he was doing a security sweep." Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. "What time?" "Started noticing him around 2, maybe 2:15. At first, I thought you'd let him out to do his business, but he didn't stop. He just kept walking the property line, stopping every few feet like he was listening for something, then moving on. I watched him for maybe 20 minutes before I finally went inside. He was outside for 20 minutes? Daniel's mind was already working through the implications, through the timeline that now extended far beyond the 12 minutes he'd been using as his reference point. At least, Mark confirmed, could have been longer before I noticed him. And Daniel, the way he was moving, I've done enough perimeter security in my career to recognize the pattern. That dog wasn't confused. He wasn't anxious. He was on patrol. He was actively monitoring something. Daniel stood up, unable to sit anymore, his body needing movement to process what he was hearing. So he knew. Hours before the fire broke through the wall, Rex knew something was wrong. That's what it looked like to me. And I'll tell you something else. Around 3:45, just before I was finally heading to bed, I looked out my bedroom window one more time, and he was sitting on your front porch, facing the house. Not the street, not the yard, the house, like he was standing guard against something inside, not outside. Daniel pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to push back against the pressure building behind them. 20 minutes, maybe longer. Rex had been trying to warn them for hours, had been monitoring a threat that existed in a frequency Daniel couldn't hear, couldn't smell, couldn't sense with any of the tools his profession had given him. I should have noticed, Daniel said, his voice rough. I should have seen him through the window, should have wondered why he was outside at 2 a.m. You were asleep, Mark said simply. That's what people do at 2 a.m, sleep. You're not supposed to be monitoring your yard for behavioral changes in your dog. That's not negligence, Daniel. That's being human. But it felt like negligence. It felt like he'd been given every possible warning and had been too blind, too deaf, too wrapped up in his own confidence to pay attention. Rex had been screaming at them in the only language he had, and we'd all been asleep, comfortable in the assumption that their detectors and their training and their systems would keep them safe. Rodriguez wants me to document what Rex sensed, says it's the only thing standing between me and a review board. Mark nodded slowly. You need to talk to whoever trained him, find out what they know about his capabilities. Because, Daniel, I've been around working dogs my whole career, narcotics, cadaver, tracking, and I've never seen anything like what I saw last night. That wasn't standard alert behavior. That was something else. Daniel looked back at the house, at the firefighters still working through the debris, checking for hotspots and structural integrity, and he thought about Rex's adoption papers, about the file that came with him from the shelter, and about the single line that had caught his attention at the time, but hadn't seemed important. Separated from canine program due to sensitivity issues. Sensitivity issues. They'd made it sound like a weakness, like something that disqualified him from service. But what if it wasn't a weakness at all? What if they'd just been measuring the wrong thing, looking for the wrong kind of response? I need to make some calls, Daniel said, already moving toward the door. Mark stood, following him inside. There's a phone in the kitchen. And Daniel? He waited until Daniel turned back. Your dog saved your family. Whatever else happened, whatever mistakes you think you made, that's the truth you need to hold on to. Rex saw something no one else could see, and he acted on it. That's not just training. That's not even just instinct. That's something special. Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat, and went to find the phone. He had a canine trainer to track down, and questions that desperately needed answers. Emily found the box in the Reynolds garage, where they'd stored the few items neighbors had helped them grab from the car before the structure was fully compromised. Noah's diaper bag, Daniel's wallet and badge, her purse, and a plastic filing container that held their important documents. The adoption papers were near the bottom, underneath their passports and birth certificates, still crisp and official-looking despite being nearly 2 years old. She'd read them once when they first brought Rex home, skimming through the medical history and behavioral notes with the casual attention of someone who assumed they were getting a normal dog with a slightly complicated past. Now, she read them like they were evidence. The first page was standard shelter intake information: name, breed, approximate age, microchip number. The second page listed his medical history: vaccinations current, no significant health issues noted. It was the third page, the one titled Behavioral Assessment and Training History, that made her slow down, that made her pull out her phone and start taking pictures of every line, every notation, every cryptic abbreviation that suddenly felt crucial. Transferred from Oak Ridge Canine Academy, week 14 of 16-week certification program. Handler, Sergeant Michael Torres. Reason for separation: hyperreactive to environmental stimuli. Recommendation: civilian adoption with experienced handler. Note: animal demonstrates exceptional alertness but unsuitable for field deployment due to overstimulation in electronic environments. Emily read the paragraph 3 times, her finger tracing the words hyperreactive and overstimulation in electronic environments like they were a code she needed to crack. The notation was clinical, dismissive even, the kind of language that turned a living creature's capabilities into a liability. But now, sitting in a borrowed garage while her son slept in a borrowed bed and her house cooled into ruins, those words took on a completely different meaning. She found the contact information on the last page: a phone number with a 615 area code and an email address that was just a string of letters and numbers followed by @oakridgecanine.org. Her hands were shaking as she dialed, the phone slippery against her palm, and she had to remind herself to breathe as it rang once, twice, 3 times. Oak Ridge Canine Academy, this is Torres. The voice was gruff, efficient, the sound of someone who answered calls while simultaneously doing 3 other things. Sergeant Torres, Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. My name is Emily Carter. I'm calling about a dog that went through your program about 2 years ago. German Shepherd. His name is Rex. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Emily thought maybe the connection had dropped, but then Torres spoke again. His tone shifted into something more careful, more present. Rex, he repeated. Yeah, I remember Rex. Why are you calling about him? We adopted him, Emily said, from the county shelter. He's been with us for 18 months. She paused, trying to figure out how to explain what had happened without sounding hysterical. Last night, he saved our son's life. He pulled him out of his crib minutes before an electrical fire broke through the nursery wall. Another pause, but this one felt different, weighted with something that might have been recognition or vindication, or maybe both. An electrical fire, Torres said slowly. Tell me exactly what happened. Emily walked him through it, starting with Daniel's call from Mark Reynolds' house at 5 a.m, his voice stripped raw as he told her that their home was gone, but everyone was safe, that Rex had done something impossible. She described the timeline Mark had witnessed: Rex pacing the perimeter at 2 a.m, the dog's decision to bypass them entirely and go straight for Noah, the windows exploding seconds after they cleared the front lawn. When she finished, Torres was quiet for so long that Emily checked her phone to make sure the call hadn't disconnected. Finally, he spoke, and his voice carried a weight that felt like confession. He's been waiting 2 years for this call, or dreading it, I wasn't sure which. What do you mean? Rex washed out of our program because he couldn't handle modern police work, not because he wasn't smart enough or obedient enough. He was one of the best dogs I've ever trained in terms of pure aptitude. But every time we ran drills in the training facility, every time we took him into buildings with security systems or computer servers, or even just standard office equipment, he'd start showing stress behaviors. What kind of stress behaviors? Pacing, whining, refusal to settle. At first, we thought it was generalized anxiety, maybe something from his puppyhood that we didn't know about. But then, one of our techs noticed a pattern. Rex only showed these behaviors in specific locations, near electrical panels, near server rooms, near any concentration of high-voltage equipment. Torres paused. We brought in a veterinary neurologist, ran some tests. Turns out Rex has an abnormally high sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, not just hearing them, actually feeling them. The neurologist compared it to how some people can feel changes in barometric pressure before a storm. Emily pressed her hand against her mouth, her mind racing through the implications. So when he was pacing our house at 2 a.m, he was in pain, or at least severe discomfort. Electrical fires generate a specific signature before they break through containment. There's arcing, voltage spikes, resistance building in the wiring. For Rex, that would have felt like standing next to a siren that only he could hear. And you knew this. Emily heard her voice turn sharp. You knew he could detect electrical problems and you sent him to a shelter marked as behaviorally unsuitable? We didn't know the full extent of his capabilities, Torres said, and now his voice carried something that sounded like regret. We knew he reacted to EM fields, but we thought it was a liability, a weakness that would put him and his handler at risk in the field. Most police work happens in environments saturated with electronics. We couldn't deploy him to schools, government buildings, commercial districts. Anywhere with modern infrastructure would have been constant torture for him. So you threw him away. We found him a good home, Torres countered, but there was no conviction in it. We made sure his adoption papers noted his sensitivities. We hoped someone would understand what he needed. Emily looked out the garage window, at the shell of her house, at the fire trucks still parked in the street, at Daniel standing in the driveway talking to an investigator. He needed someone to listen, Emily said quietly, and we almost didn't. If he'd been just a little less insistent, if he'd followed protocol and tried to alert us first instead of going straight for Noah. He's alive because he didn't follow protocol, Torres interrupted. That's what I tried to tell the review board when they recommended his separation from the program. Sometimes the dogs that wash out aren't the ones who can't do the job. Sometimes they're the ones who are doing a completely different job that we don't have the training to recognize. Emily closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks that she hadn't realized were building. Can you send me his training files? Everything you have on his EM sensitivity, the neurologist's reports, all of it. I can do better than that. I can drive down there. I'm in Nashville, so it's, 4 hours to Oak Creek? I'll bring the files myself, and I'll talk to whoever needs to hear that Rex's behavior last night wasn't luck or coincidence. It was exactly what he was built to do, and exactly what we were too short-sighted to understand. Sergeant Torres arrived at Mark Reynolds' house at 2 in the afternoon carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived multiple deployments and a manila folder thick enough to be a manuscript. He was older than Emily had expected, late 50s maybe, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time outdoors than in, and when Rex saw him come through the door, the dog's entire body went rigid with recognition. Not fear, not excitement, just the sudden alertness of someone encountering a figure from their past who represented both failure and understanding in equal measure. Torres stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes locked on Rex, and something passed between them that Emily couldn't name but could feel. A kind of acknowledgement, a mutual respect that had nothing to do with commands or obedience, and everything to do with having been misunderstood by the same system. He looks good, Torres said finally, his voice softer than it had been on the phone. You've been taking care of him. He's been taking care of us, Emily corrected, and gestured toward the kitchen table where Daniel was already sitting, a legal pad in front of him covered in notes and questions and timelines that he'd been obsessively reconstructing since dawn. Torres settled into a chair and opened his briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given this presentation before, though Emily suspected never under these circumstances. He pulled out a stack of papers held together with a binder clip and set them on the table, then added a second stack, then a USB drive that he slid toward Daniel. Everything I have on Rex. Training logs, medical records, the neurological assessment we commissioned from Dr. Sarah Chen at Vanderbilt Veterinary, video footage of his reactions during field training exercises, and my own written recommendation that was overruled by the review board. He paused, his jaw tightening. I fought to keep him in the program, for the record. Daniel picked up the first stack of papers, his eyes scanning the top page, which appeared to be a detailed incident report. Walk us through it, he said. Start with when you first noticed something was different about him. Torres leaned back in his chair, his hands folded on the table, and when he spoke, it was with the measured cadence of someone who'd thought about this story many times, who'd rehearsed it in his head during the 2 years since Rex had left his facility. Week 4 of training, he began. We were doing standard building searches in our training facility. It's an old converted warehouse, lots of rooms, lots of hiding spots. Rex was excelling at everything. His nose work was exceptional, his obedience was textbook, his drive was exactly what you want in a working dog. But every time we ran drills in the southeast corner of the building, near the electrical room, he'd start showing avoidance behaviors. "What kind of avoidance?" asked Emily. He'd slow down, start panting even though he wasn't overheated. His ears would go back, his tail would drop, and he'd try to redirect to a different area. At first, I thought maybe there was something in that room he didn't like, a smell, a previous negative experience, so I tried desensitization. I'd take him there during his meals, during playtime, trying to create positive associations, but it never worked. If anything, he got more stressed the more time he spent there. Daniel was flipping through the papers now, stopping at what looked like a chart showing Rex's heart rate during various training scenarios. "His vitals were elevated," Daniel observed. "Significantly," confirmed Torres, which is when I started thinking this wasn't behavioral in the traditional sense, this was physiological. So I started mapping his stress responses against location, and that's when the pattern emerged. Every place Rex showed distress corresponded to areas with high electrical loads, server rooms, security stations, utility closets. It wasn't about the space itself, it was about what was humming inside the walls. Emily felt something twist in her chest as she thought about their nursery, about the junction box that the fire investigator had identified as the point of origin, about Rex pacing their house for hours while that box slowly failed behind the drywall. Dr. Chen's assessment was unequivocal, Torres continued, pulling out another document that was dense with medical terminology and diagrams of canine neurological systems. Rex has an abnormally high concentration of electroreceptors in his nervous system. Most dogs have them. It's part of how they navigate, how they sense storms coming. But Rex's are overexpressed to a degree that Dr. Chen had never seen in a domestic animal. She compared it to how sharks can detect the electrical signals from a fish's heartbeat, except Rex's receptors are tuned to higher frequencies. So when electrical wiring starts to fail, when there's arcing or resistance building, he feels it, not hears it, feels it. Dr. Chen describes it as analogous to how humans react to physical pain. When you touch a hot stove, your nervous system doesn't give you a choice about pulling your hands back. It's automatic, protective. For Rex, being near electrical systems triggers the same kind of involuntary response. His body is trying to get away from something that's hurting him. Emily looked at Rex, who was lying near the back door, his eyes half closed, but his ears still mobile, still tracking our conversation. "So, last night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when he was pacing at 2 a.m, he was in agony," Torres said bluntly. "And for hours he endured it because his other instinct, the one we did train into him, was to protect. He knew something was wrong. He knew where the threat was located, and he knew there was a vulnerable human in that room. So he stayed, he monitored, he waited until the frequency reached a threshold that told him waiting was no longer an option." Daniel's hand had stopped moving across the legal pad, his pen frozen mid-word. Why didn't his body just make him run? If it was that painful, why didn't his survival instinct override everything else? Torres smiled, and it was sad and proud in equal measure. Because he's not just any dog, he's a working dog. That drive we bred into them, that need to serve and protect, it doesn't turn off just because they wash out of a program. Rex made a choice last night. He chose to stay in pain, to function through something that was causing him physical distress, because his purpose was bigger than his comfort. He paused, looking directly at Daniel. That's not behavioral. That's not behavioral instability. That's heroism in its purest form. The kitchen went quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of Noah babbling in the next room. Emily reached under the table and found Daniel's hand, gripped it tight enough that she could feel his pulse against her palm, and together they looked at the dog that had saved their son while suffering in a frequency they couldn't hear, couldn't understand, couldn't even conceive of until it was almost too late. "I need to document this," Daniel said finally, "for Rodriguez, for the investigation, but also..." He stopped, his throat working. Also because people need to know. Other families with failed canines, other dogs like Rex who got dismissed as too sensitive or too reactive, they need to know what those dogs are actually capable of. Torres nodded and pushed the USB drive closer to Daniel. Everything you need is on there, including a recommendation I'd like you to deliver to your fire department and to the county emergency management office. He paused for emphasis. Rex should be certified as an electrical detection specialist, not for police work, for fire prevention. Because if he can sense an electrical fire hours before it becomes visible, there's no reason he can't be trained to do building inspections, to sweep neighborhoods with aging infrastructure, to provide early warning for the exact kind of disaster that almost killed your family.